Greetings and salutations once again, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the Storyteller's Corner. I'm your host, Joshua T. Calkins Trugy, also known as Byron Assidious. I am recording this follow-up to the review of John Langan's The Fisherman, excellent novel. I'm trying to not show my uniform tag for my workplace, best practices. And I had said that I wanted to follow up and dive into a little bit more of spoilerish kind of material and explain what I meant in my previous video with the review. What exactly it is I believe personally that a lot of folks who have read and offered their feedback and critiques and reviews or analyses of the book, what they missed, what they got wrong, and not necessarily for any lack of understanding or intellectual capacity, because plenty of the folks who have taken the time to read the book, if they're willing to dive into the density of it, and many of whom actually did spot the themes of grief and loss and longing, I'm just kind of speculating that I may have caught something as a result of being just a little bit more of a spurg and an obsessive that may have floated over most people's heads. I could be completely wrong, though. I could be jumping at shadows. I'm not certain, but I'm going to lay it out there and let you decide. So, I'm in the back area of work here. It's actually a nice evening out here. Yeah, it's actually nice out here for it. Anyhow, part 2, I would title this overall. Grief and word choice in mythos matters. All right? Once more, reading from the handwritten notes that I was an obsessive and went through and jotted down throughout the day today. So, if you're here, you've opted to dive deeper into the black, endless oceanic depths of John Langan's The Fisherman with me. To poke into some spoiler territory, examine some vital and broadly overlooked word choices throughout the text that the vast majority of reviewers and critics in both traditional and indie spaces seem to have missed. Obviously, I'm reading right off of my script now. Firstly, and I can't stress this enough, mine is not necessarily the definitive or necessarily best examination that you're apt to find regarding analysis of this book. I'm sure. Some masters of fine arts and literature, I guarantee, would likely be able to give you the sort of TED Talk walkthrough that booktubers or book talkers would cream their jeans to. And I'm just a putz with an overactive imagination who reads a lot and studied criminal justice and application at vocational school. In short, I have only the authority and credibility that you lend me for the duration. Now, grief. Surely you've heard expressions like an ocean of grief or a flood of regret or feeling adrift in the face of a traumatic loss, yes? This is the fulcrum of events as they transpire throughout The Fisherman. And if one approaches the story with an appreciation of the Kubler-Ross model of the 5 stages of grief, the tale takes on a framework that lends itself to deeper character examination and human behavior. To begin with, there are 3 primary characters whose loss and grieving are the primary pivot points of the book's events. Abe, our narrator, Dan, his fishing buddy, and the fisherman himself, aka the guest, aka Rainer's Schwarzkünstler. Side note, this term, loosely translated from German, means practitioner of the black arts or black magic. We learn from the second and third acts of the book that the titular fisherman lost his wife and children in a savage home intrusion, one that he himself was stabbed at the start of and left for dead after watching his family violated and butchered in front of him. He barely survived and recovered, and he then went in search of arcane knowledge of a way to exact vengeance on those who had wronged him and maybe get his family back from beyond the veil of death. From what readers are exposed to, the fisherman is trapped in a kind of middle ground mix of two of the stages of grief, being denial and anger. Rejecting the idea that his family is beyond retrieval and wanting revenge on the people who took them from him, he delves into arcane rituals and power practices in an attempt to grapple with an otherworldly Leviathan. That is the term that is used, exactly, Leviathan. But the creature is also referred to by name in the text a couple of times as Apep and Apophis. It is implied, cleverly, that the fisherman is trying to wrangle and dominate this cosmic entity so that he might harness its power to bring back his departed family. This brings us to Dan, whose loved ones were also torn from him violently, though not through conscious violence, but rather an accident of fate, in a car wreck. We see him go through the numbness of denial and depression, sure, but he ends up in a middle ground of depression and bargaining via the fisherman's cajoling, though Dan's first bargaining was with himself. If his grandfather's fishing journal that we learn about in the latter half portion of the book, if that fisherman's spot of Dutchman's Creek really does hold a kind of veil magic, then, Dan reasons, I can try to find Sophie and the boys. Locating them, which he did, he was then lured by the fisherman's promises of an implied pact, life force in exchange for a long facsimile of his lost loved ones, an exchange that Dan accepts because of his grief blindness. This brings us to Abe, our narrator and lone survivor of all of this, the teller of the tale. Now, let's not pretend that the name Abraham is not an intentional choice by Langan here, in a story involving black magic, corruption, and dealings with the dead and a mythological figure out of Egypt, or rather, out of Egyptian lore in Apep. The serpent fiend of chaos and disruption, of floods and darkness, the eternal enemy of Ra, the sun god. His wife Marie was also taken from him prematurely, but via cancer, not violence. As awful and soul-crushing as that had to be, it was not sudden, it was not abrupt, and although it hurt him like no physical wound ever possibly could, Abe had the time and willpower to ultimately process his loss. In the very first third of the novel, Abe walks readers through his own dealing with the stages of grief. To be fair, his dive into depression with the alcohol abuse was the most obvious of those stages, but he did go through them all. Acceptance was the hardest for him, clearly, telling the reader of his having sensed Marie visiting him on his fishing outings, yes, but helping Dan deal with his mourning was its own final step for Abe in finishing the process of acceptance. This showcasing of how these three men contend with loss is what lends Langan's The Fisherman its immeasurable sense of grappling with the human condition. Now, aside from the psychoanalytical, except for maybe to touch upon Jung's collective subconscious maybe a little bit later, and into the etymological and the mythological, friends and neighbors, or in this case, to the philological. Listen, I'm well into the weeds at this point in this section, folks, so if you find the material from here on out a little bit nutty, I get it. But mythology and one's choice of words matter to me as a storyteller a great deal, and I'm a little baffled at the general absence of what I'm about to lay out in other examinations of this book that I've come across online. I already made mention of Apep, whose name is uttered by both Helen, the undead woman in Act 2, and the Marie/not Marie thing in Act 3. Apophis is also uttered, an alternate name for the gargantuan serpent fiend traveling the black underworld oceanic void, the nothingness. In Egyptian mythology, Apep is the enemy eternal of Ra, as I mentioned, an entity of chaos, destruction, delusion, and corruption and darkness. In several legends, this creature attempts to poison the life-giving and religiously significant and culturally significant Nile River, which itself is said in many tales in Egyptian lore to traverse the stretch between the lands of the living and the dead. Given the tie to bodies of water and their uncertain depths and mysteries, and their ties to Lovecraftian lore such as Cthulhu slumbering at the bottom of the ocean, with his ethereal fish people and gargantuan elder ones, it's easy to see why so many people would kind of automatically or naturally be drawn to or equate this novel to Lovecraft's cosmic horror or Cthulhuan legendarium. But I would posit these folks didn't look closely enough at the specific terminology used by Langan, which he deployed sparingly and expertly. Quite clever. Magic wielded by mere mortals rarely factored into Lovecraft's tales, and when they did, it was typically by cultists, which, yes, both the Fisherman and Rayner had leanings towards as occultists, not cultists. They did not worship a lone entity or a caste of deities. They studied rituals and spells, like those written of in the Book of Overthrowing Apep, a papyrus translated by R.O. Faulkner in 1937 and 38, near the end of his storied career. Much translation work had been done and popularized among scholars and academics in the 1910s and 1920s, which undoubtedly, because of the cultural significance and popularity thereof in things like pulp magazines and pulp publications, that probably served as an inspiration source for some of Lovecraft's own works. I mean, hello, the excavation of King Tut's tomb, anyone? The weird labyrinthian construction and design of the interior of the crypts played a heavy hand in the descriptions that Lovecraft used to describe the elseworld or underwater foreign realms and cityscapes left behind by these weird mer people that he hinted toward, and their hieroglyphic pictorial stories left and etched in the stones of their homes. Perhaps the only hiccup that I hit in all of this, however, is when Marie, not Marie, clarified to Abe that the fish thing that he and Dan pulled from the water was a nymph. This term, this creature, stems from Greek mythos rather than Egyptian, but in The Fisherman, these creatures seem to serve exactly the same sort of function as they did in Greek legends and mythologies, feigning the temporary form of women, especially a lost loved one. They would lure fishermen and sailors to a watery demise, either drowning them, as Marie/not Marie almost did to Abe, or ensorceling and then devouring them, like Dan was devoured by Sophie and the kids. A man who died in such fashion, according to the mythology, or according to some of the legends, would then become a vengeful spirit haunting other fishermen, like Dan did to Abe at the end of the story. The novel's final scenes also leave a whisper of the god-awful, if one considers the precise events of the third act. When Abe came upon Marie in the woodland around Dutchman's Creek, there was a scene that was, well, let's be honest, pretty standard fare in a horror novel, as I've mentioned in previous examinations of the genre. There was a sex scene. It wasn't especially graphic, owing in large part to Langan's masterful use of Abe as a narrative cipher using his voice, which is itself measured, almost reserved. But he doesn't shy away when talking about the end of this coupling. The dude didn't exactly strap on a rubber in the heat of the moment. He has this rude realization of what Marie/not Marie is in the afterglow of their coupling, before the creature reasserts the illusion over itself. We kind of shudder and we move on with the story, right? Except at the very end of the book, when Abe tells of a nightmare/dream that he has several times, one where he sees The Marie not Marie bobbing in the black void ocean with two smaller creatures similar to her, whom Abe observes, quote, sort of have my mother's nose. Looks like him and Marie might have had those kids they wanted all along, huh? Just in a very unpleasant and unnatural way. In terms of the small point I was going to mention, that I didn't jot down before, but thought of a little later on, regarding the whole concept of Jung and the collective subconscious. In the middle act, there's a section where I believe it's Lottie or Clara, I can't remember which one of Rayner's kids, so it was Lottie, was in the bakery. She's being hounded by Helen, the undead woman. And she's in this dark, lightless closet. And Helen is muttering something at her. She's mouthing some kind of strange words in a dead tongue that she doesn't quite understand, but has the effect of causing her to sort of hallucinate. And she sees this, she ends up mentally being projected to that otherworldly, underworld, black oceanic mass, where she sees these bobbing bodies, these different glowing versions of people she knows from around the town, from around the work camp. And these versions of these people, including one that looks like herself, like a reflection of her, just in kind of a weird creature-like form, muttering things from their subconscious thoughts and desires, these hidden shadow thoughts, things that we dare not say out loud, but that are running perhaps in our subconscious mind, all in that same collective body of water, similar to Jung's conjecture that the collective subconscious could be visualized as a kind of oceanic, depthless, joined body of consciousness into that water concept. I'm just noodling around with that right now. But anyhow, that's going to do it for this follow-up of specifics. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for stopping in once again. Thank you for listening. I hope that you take care of yourselves, and as always, keep reading.